This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio brings you relevant and detailed discussions and interviews on software engineering topics every 2 weeks. Thanks to our audience and the partners listed on our website for supporting the podcast. Welcome listeners to a new episode of Software Engineering Radio. This time I'm here in Amsterdam at the PPL conference, the Practical Product Lines, with the emphasis on practical. It's actually a quite nice conference, and I promised to Mark Dalgarno, the organizer, that I'll mention the conference in the podcast, so he has some benefit from that. Today's episode is a discussion about product lines, about complex software, about speed, about time to market and things like that with Jan Bosch. Hello, Jan.
Hello, Marcus. How are you today?
We're still a bit tired, but otherwise I'm fine. An aspirin helped me this morning. And we're going to talk about various things regarding complexity and speed and how to build large software and variability and variance of software. And to understand what we're going to talk about, I think it's very important to understand your background. So why don't you talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, and where you come from and where you got to where you're now.
Very good. First of all, let me say that I'm honored to be interviewed by you, Marcus, on Software Engineering Radio. It's really a pleasure to meet you again.
Thank you.
I am currently VP of Engineering Process at a company called Intuit. Intuit is, I think, well known to our US listeners, but not so well known for people in other parts of the world necessarily. I've been there for 2.5 years now. Before that, I was head of the software architecture, software applications and technology laboratory at Nokia Research Center in Helsinki, Finland. Mm-hmm. But I think that some people that are listening to this may know me from the time that I worked as a professor of software engineering in the Netherlands and in Sweden, where my main focuses were software architecture and software product lines. Mm-hmm. And the reason that we are both here at this conference is because I think both you and I are giving and have given keynotes at this conference this time.
Okay, and your keynote it's titled basically "What Got Us Here Won't Get Us There," which basically expresses a change coming up or a change that already happened. So it requires people to rethink maybe some of what they have been doing in the past. So can you characterize what you think changes and what the thing is that we need to do differently in the future?
Right. I believe that software engineering is at an inflection point where traditionally we have focused a lot on what I call integration-oriented software engineering, where specifically the integration stage, but even a lot of the work at the development stage and earlier has been very much focused on a centralized, heavily manual approach to software engineering. What I believe that I increasingly see happen in Silicon Valley, where I live these days, but also in other places in the world, is that we're moving to something that I call composition-oriented software engineering, which focuses a lot more on decentralized approach to software development that have a much, much higher degree of automation with respect to the way you bring the system together, the way you do regression testing, the way you do deployment of software, etc. Now, and that's what I tried to cover in my keynote talk yesterday, that I believe that is a major transition that is taking place right now, and that software product lines, which is the topic of this conference, need to be deployed in a rather fundamentally different, much more compositional fashion than what we've done in the past. And as a second trend that perhaps we can touch upon later on, become increasingly prepared as the basis for a software ecosystem where the platform in the software product line isn't just used internally in the company, but is also used outside the company.
So it's basically going from a closed world assumption where you know all the players, all the stakeholders, and also all the products that are going to be built with your product line assets, going to an open world assumption where you basically say we're providing some building blocks and we don't know who is going to use them and how.
Yes, that is exactly where I think that we're going. If we look at almost every company that has a large successful product line out there, even though they are very successful, the amount of functionality that is needed by these companies is impossible to build all in-house. So they are looking for effective ways to partner with an ecosystem of developers that helps them develop the software that they are looking for, and that has all kinds of benefits. It increases the stickiness of your platform and of your product line and the products in your product line. It allows you to do a lot of innovative experimentation that we couldn't do if we would only do this inside the company. And because of that, I believe that both for small developers as well as for successful platform and product line companies, software ecosystems are very, very important.
Mm-hmm. So, looking at it from an architectural perspective, how is a software ecosystem different from a product line? I already mentioned this open-closed thing, but what does this mean concretely?
So it concretely means a number of different things. The first thing that it means is that several of the operating mechanisms that we traditionally used inside a company that were very much assuming centralized control, centralized coordination, etc., no longer work when you have hundreds or thousands or perhaps even more developers outside your company working in an undirected fashion. Mm-hmm. They do whatever they want to do on top of your platform, and you can try to influence them, but you can't control them to the same extent as you do inside a company. Now, that has a lot of consequences. It means that teams can basically release their software at any time they want to release it, and they teams are self-directed, so centralized road mapping does not take place. These teams pick themselves what they want to build on top of your platform. It requires a much simpler architecture that also is much more focused on backward compatibility and interface negotiation to work out small mismatches between interfaces. It also means that rather than giving your customers a completely pre-configured and pre-integrated product, your customers will increasingly start to compose their own product. I mean, the simplest and example is perhaps an iPhone with all the applications on top of it. There are lots of other applications. If you look at Facebook, you can see that the applications already are deeper integrated into the product. But I believe that for many companies, this is that have a successful product line, they will in time move to a software ecosystem, and that requires a number of rather big changes in the way that software gets developed.
And also, I guess, in culture, because you don't, well, the people who have formerly been customers or users, which is kind of just users, they're going to become in some sense peers, because they might also contribute to your ecosystem and thereby indirectly to your revenue, and also to the system and the architecture and all the stuff around it.
Yeah. No, I think I heard you say two things. There is a major cultural change that needs to take place inside a company. One of the quotes that I heard and used yesterday and I heard recently is "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And I think that for many situations, it's easy to formulate a software ecosystem strategy for a company. It's much harder to drive the accompanying cultural change that is needed in order for that to be successful. So that's the first aspect. The other aspect is what I have seen both at my time at Intuit and at my time at Nokia is that focus on the customer, working in a customer-centric fashion is absolutely crucial for success. It has defined a major part of the success for Nokia being extremely customer-focused. It has been almost all of the success for Intuit, and I think that we're going to increasingly see this with many companies going forward, that we take our customers much more serious, do not treat them as we would treat little children, but view them as peers and as co-innovators.
So just to make this clear, if I understand you correctly, then you're not saying the following. You continue in your company as you did in the past, and then you have a bunch of APIs that your peers/users/ecosystem guys use. What you're suggesting is kind of that the internal way of developing systems kind of reflects the ecosystem approach. So you do it internally the way you would build, use the term mashups, outside.
Yes, I think that One of the things that I stressed a lot in my talk yesterday is that speed is the critical differentiator in software engineering going forward. I used the example of a company that releases 57 times per day in my talk, which I think is rather unrealistic for most organizations. That requires, for being able to operate on such a speed, requires that you work at a highly decoupled compositional fashion both inside and outside the company. And what I believe is that the mechanisms that you need to effectively work with external developers, developers in your ecosystem, the same interaction mechanisms you can apply inside your organization, creating a good separation between the people that release and develop the platform and the people that build the products or additional chunks of product-specific functionality on top of the platform. So I think you very correctly identified that indeed the mechanisms that you traditionally would only have used in the interaction between the company and the outside world, you're trying to pull into the company and try to use them as mechanisms to decouple development and development teams.
A little while ago, actually, I think it was a couple of years ago, I did an episode with Werner Vogels from Amazon.
Right.
And he told me that the various teams who develop certain features or, let's say, services within the Amazon platform do that from bottom to top. They specify requirements, they come up with the architecture, they do the implementation. So it's a much more vertical integration. And they also have very small teams. And I think this is necessary to be agile in the sense you're proclaiming.
Yes. I think that's a very good viewpoint. I must say that also yesterday I mentioned a number of the things that we have learned from Amazon in my talk. So one of the rules that I really like around Amazon is the 2 pizza rule, which basically says that no team can be larger than what you can feed with 2 pizzas if they are really, really hungry. Another one, which is more architecture related, is the 3 API rule, which says that no team should have to bother about more than 3 APIs, because if you need to bother about more than 3 APIs, you get into a situation in which the architecture is simply too complex for small teams to move aggressively. There are 2 ways, however, to organize software development, and I'm still of two minds which one is better. You can have component teams, where a team is responsible for a component and basically evolves that component either through centralized road mapping and requirements management or in a much more bottom-up, we will decide how to evolve our component. And then you have the notion of feature teams. And I know that, for instance, eBay, and I think from the description that you just gave, also Amazon, work with feature teams. Yeah. The advantage of a feature team is that it provides much more an integrated focus on one feature, top to bottom, throughout the architecture. The challenge, I believe, is that it is harder to integrate all the different features during release time. eBay, for instance, has, from what I've understood, a bi-weekly release in which during 48 hours all the feature teams basically integrate their code into the release code line, which is sometimes a very complicated process. The other aspect of that is that I believe, but I do not, and this is a belief, this is not backed up by any scientific evidence, that the architecture will most likely suffer from more rapid erosion when you have feature teams, which could be a disadvantage. But however, also component teams have their disadvantages.
I was going to mention that because on the one hand side, you're advocating decoupling and decentralization and distribution of responsibilities. On the other hand, if you want to build a successful ecosystem, I think what you need is a consistent set of APIs, let's call it a consistent architecture, so that your peer, developer, user, ecosystem guys, it's not too complicated. So there is, I think, a tension regarding how much do you govern so things are consistent and small and simple and orthogonal, and how much you give people freedom so that they're flexible and agile and quickly to release.
Right. The fact that we have decoupled, decentralized teams doesn't free us from the obligation to have an explicit focus on the architecture. That is not necessarily something that the component or feature teams should be concerned about, but there should be a team that works hard at evolving the architecture, evolving it in such a way that it maintains its simplicity, but it is also refactored to optimize it for the most likely future extensions that are going to come to the architecture. That requires, of course, that the architecture evolves. That means that we have the standard processes, as you, for instance, see in the Java world, where interfaces get deprecated, get removed, get added. You support different versions of interfaces over time, and that is something that I believe needs to continue to be in place in order to make sure that we have a consistent architecture. The most important thing is that for most of the work that any development team does, they only need to interact with the documented and formalized interface that the architecture provides, and as little as possible need to coordinate with other teams in their environment that are working on either other features or on other components to the largest extent possible.
Since you're emphasizing speed so much, I guess there is another consequence. It basically means that if you have to decide between not releasing an API because it's not yet perfect, or releasing an API and then using subsequent refactoring or incremental improvement to make it nice, then you would probably opt for the latter. So you get something out there, so you start the ecosystem, and then over time you make it nice or provide maybe a new version of the API that's cleaned up.
Perfection is the enemy of the good, is my experience. I think it's an American saying, but I think it's true also in software development. The only way in which you can validate whether you took the right design decisions or not is by putting software in the hands of customers, either customers as in end users or customers as in ecosystem developers. I believe that that's the only way to validate things, and we have been, I think, too reliant on our belief that we can actually predict what customers or external developers actually want in practice. That is just not true. We have to give it to them and ask them for their opinion as they use it in practice.
Now, many of the examples you've mentioned, eBay, Amazon, Google, are web applications.
Right.
Classical Web 2.0 stuff, right? So I can very well imagine how that works in this space. Also, releasing 5 times a day or 10 times a week or 7 times a month is very easy if you don't actually ship anything if you do a release. Now, your company, Intuit, as far as I know, at least traditionally, has done shrink-wrapped products you run in your PC. How does this... I mean, you can't ship a new box every 10 hours. You can't even require your users to download and upgrade every 3 times a day. So how does that play out? Are you moving away from the shrink-wrapped, or...?
So I can't in detail describe our business strategy for obvious reasons. What I can say is for many years already, QuickBooks, which is one of our main shrink wrap products, as well as, by the way, TurboTax, when you buy it on a CD, whenever there is an internet connection available, and almost all of our customers have internet connections these days, will download what we call slipstreams in the traditional terminology, which are basically upgrades or replacement of specific components in the product that allow us to release new functionality or bug fixes or other kinds of things. So that's becoming increasingly likely. We are also, or increasingly possible, we are using that increasingly even in our traditional products to almost sell an empty box. Basically, you get a CD with a license key, and a very large chunk of the functionality gets downloaded at the moment that you install your software, rather than installed from the CD. And we increasingly put downloadable or online functionality to integrate well into the product. So this year for the first time, we actually put an app store in our QuickBooks product, which is a new kind of thing, which allows us not to only offer content developed by Intuit developers, but increasingly also functionality developed by external developers. And if you go to Intuit Partner Platform, you will see, if you Google for that, you will certainly find the link. You will see the opportunities that you have as an external developer to build inside the Intuit ecosystem that is millions or tens of millions of users large.
You worked for Nokia back then. I don't know how much you want to, go back to that world or what you're willing to say, but if you would still work for Nokia, how would you do this in more embedded, physical product environments? Is this something that applies there, or?
Yeah, so I must say, and this is perhaps my personal view on career development or following one's career, I believe that many of the innovations that we now see in the Web 2.0, small startup, Silicon Valley style companies are techniques that over the coming few years will come down to the embedded systems world as well. When in the time at Nokia, and I don't think that this is in any way, shape or form secret, is that we were and are increasingly interested in over-the-air updates, which means that you can release and push new functionality to a mobile device after it has been bought by a customer in the market in various forms. I mean, you can do it through a PC-centric upload, or you can do this by real over-the-air uploads in areas where data charges are relatively low. I believe that since more and more embedded systems are becoming networked, it becomes more and more feasible to drive these kinds of models that we have been describing here as well, where even in embedded systems you can release functionality basically continuously and evolve the functionality of the embedded systems. However, it of course requires an architectural approach that protects the part of the embedded system that normally would need to be certified, and also allows us to prove to certification authorities, etc., that part of the system will never be touched and cannot be brought down through functionality that gets downloaded on top of this embedded system. And I believe that this is a direction that we will go to with cars, with consumer electronics, with mobile phones, with all kinds of embedded devices that we can see, probably starting on the industrial embedded systems, because the cost of goods is relatively, or the bill of materials is not as sensitive as it is for mass market consumer products.
So that kind of gives us a good understanding of where you are and what your thinking is today. Let's go back to the, let's say, more classical product lines approach, which is kind of closed and it's a very managed approach. A lot of things are coordinated, and the big design upfront doesn't have as bad a reputation as everywhere else in that space. Now that conflicts quite a bit with what you talked about. So let's look at a classical approach of software product lines, maybe a short summary, 2-3 minutes, and then tie this back to what we've discussed in the last couple of minutes.
The first thing which is very important to understand is that software product lines should be viewed in the scope of software use in the broad sense, and I hope that you allow me to elaborate a little bit on this topic. If you look back from the 1960s, I think 1968 was the first conference around this, the NATO conference, we see that we have two types of reuse. We have inter-organizational reuse, the reuse of operating systems, databases, graphical user interface, etc., which has been extremely successful. Then if we look at the intra-organizational reuse of modules, components, etc., we see that has been much less successful than all the external reuse approaches. So software product lines proved to be the first highly successful reuse approach that was successful inside an organization. And if you look at all kinds of companies ranging from Nokia to Siemens to Bosch to Intuit to Ericsson, etc., all those companies were extremely successful because they managed to link a new business strategy to a new approach, which was software product lines, and managed to grow their business or one of their business units with an order of magnitude or with an enormous amount of success. And that has been, I think, the story behind software product lines and why it has received so much attention. So that's a traditional software product line approach. What you see within a software product line approach is typically that a company goes through an evolution path. The first step is a company starting from several product teams that are developing products completely independent of each other and do not have any sharing whatsoever. The next step is often to start to standardize the external components, the infrastructure on top of which you build your products. You standardize on the operating system, you standardize on the database, on the network protocols, on the graphical user interfaces, on a web server, whatever you need in your product, but you standardize on components that you can get from the outside. That only gets you so far because your company is leading in a particular domain, and that domain functionality you can't get from anywhere. The next step then is for many companies to develop a platform. A platform is basically a layer of company-specific, domain-specific functionality that all the products in the scope of the product line need. It's just a platform. It is not a product line in my definition yet.
Right. Because the next step would be?
Because the next step would be what I call the software product line, which is where the set of shared components and the product line architecture contain functionality that is used by some or most, but not all products.
Right.
And once you reach that point, software variability management, which has been one of the big research topics for the last decade in software product lines, really becomes an issue. Now,
because you need to decide which thing goes into which product.
Exactly.
And how it's configured, maybe.
Exactly. So you have components that are either used in some products and not in others, and that are configured differently based on which product they are used in, or in which configuration of a product they're used. There is, however, and this is important to realize, a subsequent maturity step, which I call the configurable product base, where there is basically a code asset or a code base from which, through automated configuration, I can automatically derive all the different products. Then I still have variability management, but it is all automated. There is no manual management of variability anymore. Now, what you see is that in a stable domain, for a company that is successful in that domain and spends a number of years on a product line, they will evolve to that configurable product base stage. For most markets and for most companies, they will stay in between a platform and a software product line approach. Now, there is a bit of a challenge with software product lines to the extent that we typically talk about sizable software assets, and if you continue to build them with the integration-oriented approach that we started this interview with, typically the speed at which you can execute tends to become lower. So at some companies, the platform release frequency slips from 6 months to 9 months to 12 months to sometimes even 15 or 18 months. So you have release cycles that are very, very slow with respect to the central platform because of the size of the software product line and the complexities of managing all the variability and all the dependencies between the different assets, which are not managed automatically through the architecture, but are managed through process and through manual activity. There are some deviations of this, but I think in the interest of time, there is the notion of product populations that Rob van Ommering has been working on. There is the notion of program of product lines for extremely large systems, but let's not go into that particular aspect right now. So that gives a little bit of a context of the traditional product line approach, so to say.
And then the ecosystem comes in as a next step after the product line, where you allow external folks to contribute to products in the sense of the product line.
Yes, that is exactly how I think about it. The way that I think about it is that going from a system or product specific way of working to a software product line is typically driven by company-driven variability. A company has many similar products and wants to exploit the commonality between those products while managing the variability. In software ecosystems, the transition from software product lines to software ecosystems is often driven by customer needs or customer desired variability. Customers want to have much more configurability, much more functionality that they can use that the company itself cannot provide. And then what you see is that companies feel a push towards opening up that platform, providing it to external developers to have other companies help them satisfy customer needs.
Yeah.
And this is not just help, this also has a number of other quite significant advantages.
And then obviously it needs to be composition oriented as opposed to, let's say, feature model selection kind of stuff, because there isn't the whole thing from which you select.
Exactly. No, I think earlier in this conversation you mentioned the notion of a closed world assumption.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
you cannot use a closed world assumption in this case. Especially in when you have an undirected ecosystem, so where the developers do not get specific instructions from you on what to build, but they can basically make it up themselves. They will always think of things that you didn't think about from the beginning. Yeah,
which is of course what makes you successful in the end.
In the end, that's exactly, because the way one way to look at a software ecosystem is that for the platform company, it is a relatively cost-effective and fast way to have a lot of innovation experimentation take place with customers, which you can, and this is where things become a little bit of a tension point between external developers and the platform or product line company. You can incorporate successful innovations into the platform when they prove to be successful. The way things often happen is you see multiple domain-specific, customer-specific additions being built on top of your platform. When you as a product line or platform company see that there are multiple out there and that the customers really like them, you know that you have a piece of functionality that you can go and platformize and pull into the platform in order to make your own, or make sure that your own platform remains competitive. Now, so in that sense, then you see that there are a lot of experimentation took place. You can take the successful experiments and over time incorporate them in your platform and work out financial reimbursement mechanisms with the external developers and other ways in order to make sure that there is a continuous flow of new innovations coming in.
It's probably also a good recruiting tool. You just hire the best ecosystem guys into your company.
If you look at some companies that have been very successful on the operating system platform side, I mean, one company starts with an M, I suppose, they have a history of buying the successful companies that have built new innovative functionality on top of their operating system. Or they build it themselves and then outcompete everybody else. But they have actually have a history of buying companies that built valuable functionality on top of their operating system, just to pull that functionality into the operating system.
Just to make the distinction clear, all of this discussion is not about open sourcing your product. You're still a commercial company. Your product is basically still closed source, except for the APIs, of course. So it has nothing to do with this idea. Although of course some of the processes and approaches of community building are relevant in both.
Yes, I think that there is a parallel with the open source software community, but it is clearly not the same as open source. I mean, we are still looking at a platform or a core set of functionality that has significant value to its customers to the point that they are willing to exchange what our CEO calls value for value. So they're willing to pay us for something that gives them a lot of value. In that picture, the picture that we're now looking at, that unfortunately the people on the radio cannot see, there are two areas where open source actually plays a role. At the bottom layers of the stack, where functionality is highly commoditized, we may either put solutions in the open source domain in order to share the maintenance cost of infrastructure with other players in the industry. The other technique that we are using is to put small open source seed applications in the ecosystem as a starting point to help others, external developers, to get going in new domains where they possibly wouldn't have either entered directly or not have entered in the same way as we would have done. However, in that place, the license terms are often on the software are typically different. because we do want to have the opportunity to, once that functionality, which is very early in the adoption curve, receives mainstream adoption, we want to be able to pull that functionality into our platform, and we then don't want to be constrained by the open source license approach that we would perhaps have in a highly commoditized software. So to summarize, there are parallels with open source communities. I mean, we have community building, etc. And we do use open source in our ecosystem approach, but it is not equivalent to an open source software approach.
Now, there is one thing that I find interesting. If you want people to contribute to your systems and to your applications, then I guess you have to make it as easy for them as possible, in the sense that you can't necessarily ship them your whole whatever big fat server-based platform. You have to maybe even componentize your platform so people have, can pick apart and start with a very small environment. So what's the consequence for the platform, for the basis of your applications using that approach? Is there a consequence, or what did you experience there?
There is definitely a consequence, but one of the ways that we work with this is that we offer a hosting environment for external developers, as well as service APIs that they can access, so they don't need to download and create a local copy of a very large and complicated infrastructure that wouldn't be real anyway, because there wouldn't be any customer data to experiment with, etc., etc. So rather than asking external developers to install a copy of the infrastructure on their environment, we suggest that both for prototyping and testing and for deployment purposes, they use our infrastructure. But we do offer, and this is how we do it at Intuit. I mean, there are other companies that take different approaches. We do offer federated approaches as well, in which you can host your solution in your own infrastructure, but you can federate in through web services into our infrastructure.
So in your case, you're actually so again, going back to the traditional shrink wrap Quicken and stuff, that was basically a desktop product.
Right.
Has this evolved to your web-based application service providing kind of thing, or is this a new platform, a new environment?
We are actively moving all functionality that we have been providing on the desktop and on a CD traditionally to online as well. That doesn't mean that we drop our desktop products. And again, now we get into business strategy, and I'm not the right person to talk about that. But we are moving the same functionality or new functionality that makes more sense in an online or in a mobile context to the web. And we actively work where we can to make sure that you have access to your data, independent of whether you are on your desktop, or whether you are on the web, or whether you are on your mobile device, or independent of location. So that we try to separate data from the exact deployment infrastructure in which you're using things. So you basically ubiquitous access to all your data all the time.
It's also an interesting architectural challenge to build functionality in a way that it can be used on the server in a very scalable environment, on a desktop, and maybe even on a phone.
Yes.
And starts with the selection of the programming language, I guess.
There is a lot of decisions that need to be taken in that context, but of course it's clear that the more restricted the resources that you have on the device that is with the customer at that time, the more you only do UI on the device and most of the computing in the server background. But I believe, and there was a bit of doubt where the industry would go, I think, a number of years ago, but it's clear that customers want their data to be secure and stored in one place and maintained from a privacy perspective, but they want to have access to it from wherever they basically are. And I think that that's not just something for the Web 2.0 world. Over time, you will see exactly the same in the embedded systems world, where you can basically access your car from wherever you are, not just from sitting in your car, which is, I think, a new development that many embedded systems companies haven't really spent too much time thinking about.
So basically, what you said is that you're building a new platform in addition to the existing shrink-wrapped platform. I guess one of the challenges is that the new platform initially requires a lot of investment and doesn't create any money. So how do you convince you said you're not the right person to talk about business. So I guess there is somebody you need to convince, the guy who talks about business. How do you do this?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and not necessarily a very trivial one to answer. The first myth that I would like to address here is that many people believe that embarking on a software product line approach requires a major upfront investment. Now, I do not believe that is actually the case. I think we can get going on a product line initiative against a relatively lower effort. There is, however, a second myth, and that's what I've seen at many of the companies that I've worked with or for in the past, and that is that people believe that the new platform will be the mother of all platforms and replace all the existing platforms. That has, in my experience, never been the case. Once there is a platform or product line out there that has revenue generating products out in the market, there's almost never a business reason to actually retire that platform. What you do see is that over time resources move from the existing platforms to the new platforms. So I have a model in which based on experience with a number of companies in introducing product lines, where I basically try to map out what I call 4 adoption phases for going through a new product line. The first phase is what I call the exploration phase. Then there is the initiation phase, the build-out phase, and then the institutionalized phase.
Okay, so I guess let's look at each of them briefly.
Absolutely.
So the exploration phase is where you probably find out whether the new thing makes sense.
Yes, that is exactly the idea. It's often driven out of the product development organization and based on a frustration with some of the existing platforms and trying to stretch them into the new requirements that exist in the organization. And what you see is that it's relatively small investment that takes place there. There is never any expectation to generate revenue. It's mostly around prototypes and experimentation, and there is a heavy technology focus. There's not that much of a link to the business strategy at that point. If you are a process, methods, and tools person, the focus that you have in this case is that you start to develop the vision and early design of processes, of tools, of operating mechanisms, and you try to figure out, okay, if we are going to work in this fundamentally new fashion and approach with this new platform, what would this look like? And what is the work that has a long lead time? That assuming that this will work, we should initiate now, and this can be SEM or test automation, deployment approach, or something like that. So you develop a vision of what it would take to be successful here.
And then the initiation phase is probably broadening the scope, getting people interested, real people, real developers, and helping them get started. Yeah,
so between the exploration phase and initiation phase,
it's a decision, right?
There is a decision that takes place. And this is one of the things that is, I believe, very important. At this point, there needs to be an explicit link to the business strategy. So there has to be an agreement with the business side of the house that there is a need for a new platform, that the new platform will have a specific scope or focus within the overall product portfolio of the company, and that it requires some level of investment that is agreed upon initially. Now, and then the idea is there is a noticeable investment. There are resources being drained away from the existing product lines and platforms. And this is the hard part, there is no revenue at this stage, which is really difficult. There is a little bit of upfront investment that is necessary, not as much as people often think, but there is some work that is needed. At this point, you also start to develop the first offerings or first products or first services. So the idea is that as rapidly as possible, you get a first offering or product or service out in the hands of customers, first in an alpha or beta approach, but as much as possible in a revenue generating context. My experience is that once you generate revenue on top of a new platform or a new product line, it's much easier to make sure that you don't get killed in the large R&D
so
battles.
I guess you want to keep this phase short.
The shorter, the better. I yesterday in my keynote described it as you're a beautiful little bird sitting in a swamp full of poisonous snakes, and everyone is trying to kill you.
Yeah.
Now there you get into the hardest part from a process methods and tools perspective, because what you need to do is you need to transition the staff that gets to work on this new platform in a way that they completely rethink in terms of mindset, process, tools, architecture, etc., how they go about software development. And since these people most often are from within the company, have been working on the old platforms and product lines, if you do not give them explicit guidance, they will typically fall back in the old ways of working, and you will not see half of the benefits or even none of the benefits of this new platform initiative or product line initiative. So one of the things that I've tried in the past, which has been quite successful, is what we've called the Immersion Program, where during 1 or 2 weeks you take new staff or staff that comes into this new product line and educate them to the largest extent possible on this new approach. Brainwash is one approach to think about this, often not as positively considered by engineers. And then after that, once they get working, give them good support from a coaching perspective, so you can build a core of a culture around this new platform. I think that that's very important. So at the end of the initiation phase, the first offerings are in the market. They're typically on the fringes of the product portfolio for the company, because you don't want to take too much risk, and you are generating revenue. Once you've reached that stage, you can feel pretty good about yourself typically.
And then the political battles probably are reduced quite a bit, because the people understand the potential.
Exactly.
And then you're stepping into the build-out phase. That's when you really start believing in that's your next way of making money.
Exactly. And the importance here is to stress to everyone in the company, this is not focused on taking away resources from the existing or revenue generation from the existing product lines.
You want to grow, not replace.
Exactly. The idea is that the new product line is growing the business, so it's creating new opportunities that we couldn't realize with our existing product lines and platforms. So what you then see is that the amount of resources is increasing, but also the revenue is increasing, which makes it often a lot easier. And the offerings are there are already offerings in the market, but increasingly many offerings are starting to touch the core of your market. So you start to complement your existing product lines in your core markets with new offerings or new products or services based on this new software product line. What you see is that at this stage, the core of the business, so the key business leaders typically become heavily involved, because they see that there's potential here, they see that there is revenue here, there's growth opportunity here, and they want to be actively involved and focused on this. And what you then see is that over time, there will be a shift of resources from the old product lines and platforms to the new product line, but that's only natural. It basically means that the old platforms are mature, are basically in the cash cow stage. So what you want to do is to generate as much revenue from them and basically shift investment to the old one. From a process methods and tools perspective, you then really focus on driving scalability, safeguarding architectural integrity. It's very easy to have a very high level of architectural erosion in this stage, so you need to have selected refactoring efforts that gets invested in. And this is often also where variability management becomes a real issue.
I think that the key message to the people in the old platform is that you don't actively kill it, but you have something new that you can move to once the old platform naturally fizzles out. Yes, I guess that's the way maybe to formulate it.
And the idea is that the old platform for the old platform to fizzle out, as you described it, often takes many years, sometimes even decades. But the amount of resources working on those old platforms tends to decrease quite significantly over time. And I think that's important.
So then the last phase is the institutionalized phase. That's where this is the new mainstream.
So then the platform has become the new mainstream. As you said, the investment has stabilized. You have high and growing revenue. You have your next generation offerings out in your core markets and in the growth areas that you are focusing this on. And people don't talk about this being the new platform anymore. I mean, it's just the current platform. Yeah. And then the focus for process methods and tools focuses on process optimization, on institutionalizing the management of commoditization of functionality, because then you need to become concerned about not only what new functionality do you take into the platform, but also what functionality do you actively push out and replace with external components, so you are not spending resources on chunks of functionality that your customers couldn't care less about. I mean, that's not, if anything that's contextual for your organization, you should spend as little resources on. These are the commodities, exactly. Yeah. And then the final is that you have to remain very vigilant with respect to design erosion for the architectural level. So continue to invest in architecture refactoring efforts. The challenge is that if you don't do that, over time, typically in many product lines, the lifetime of the product line can be diminished quite significantly if you do not keep it up to date to the current needs of the organization.
I think that was really interesting.
Good.
Is there anything else in that context that you want to add?
For me, the important thing here is that it's important to realize that there are a number of phases, that there are toll gates, and that there are ways to go from one stage to the next, and make sure that you do all the right things in that stage. What perhaps is important to mention at this stage is, and again, if you go to my personal website, if you Google my name, you will find it.
Actually, we'll put this stuff into the show notes, so people don't even have to Google.
Well, that's even better. There are some presentations and some articles that describe what I call the 5 dimensions that you have to consider during the adoption stages. So that's how do you select the functionality to build? How do you manage the architectural harmonization once you bring in new products into this new product line? How do you organize? Do you actually formalize the organization, or do you do this as part of the existing product teams? How do you manage funding? And how do you scope the shared components? And I think that these 5 dimensions are rather fundamental in getting the adoption of a software product line approach right. And then you'll see that over time, from the early success to the increasing scope to increasing maturity, there are different decisions that you have to take in these five dimensions that I described, and for each of these dimensions, and depending on the stage where you are, you need to take a different approach, based on my experience with all the companies that I worked with in the past on this.
And I guess in general, introducing a new platform, new product line is introducing something new, and there is a lot of writings about how you introduce new things into organizations. For example, the book from Linda Rising and Marilyn Mann's, Fearless Change. So I guess taking some of these things into account, and I think we had an episode on that stuff, that's why I'm mentioning it, is probably also a useful thing.
Yeah. It's very easy, and especially for researchers, often it's very easy to think about the strategy and envisioning of how it could work within an organization. Actually achieving successful implementation in an organization is infinitely much harder.
Yes.
And in Silicon Valley, the term is ideas are a dime a dozen, basically. It's all about execution. Yeah. And that's where we are here as well. The execution of a successful software product line introduction and adoption is not trivial, and you really benefit from thinking very carefully on how to do this, and where possible bringing in some external expertise in order to make sure that you're not falling into any of the traps that other people have already fallen into. You can fall into new traps.
Exactly. There are still enough new traps for you to fall into, so you're not too successful. Okay.
But as a concluding remark, I want to say that if you look at all these companies that have successfully adopted software product lines in the past, if you look at Nokia, if you look at Philips, if you look at Bosch, Ericsson, HP, Thales in the Thales Naval, Intuit, and even small and medium-sized companies, when you are successful, with combining a new business strategy with a successful software product line introduction, you can grow your business tenfold. The rewards are enormous. And that's what we shouldn't forget. This is not just a technology thing. This is combining technology strategy and business strategy in a very fundamental and successful fashion.
And just to make this clear, you didn't, in what we just recorded and talked about, you didn't argue against product lines. You just said that product lines in this new world have to take a little bit of a different form.
Yes, what I'm concerned about is that if you are not careful about how you introduce software product lines, the traditional approach may very well make you less agile and less fast. And the work that I'm currently looking at is what I call compositional software engineering, is adopt software product lines, but do it in such a way that you do not slow anyone down. Instead, you allow people to accelerate even further. And if you focus on speed instead of on efficiency, I think you can combine highly successful product lines with a very rapid and agile introduction of new products into the market.
Okay, very good. I think that wraps it up. Thanks very much, Jan, for being on the show, as we like to say.
Very good. Thank you very much for inviting me, Marcus. I had a great time.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for listening to Software Engineering Radio. Software Engineering Radio is an educational program brought to you by Hillside Europe. If you want more information about the podcast and all the other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. If you want to support us, you can donate to the SE Radio team via the website, or you can advertise for SE Radio, for example, by clicking on the Dig Reddit Delicious links and the /dot button. To contact the team, please send email to team@se-radio.net, or if it is specific to an episode, please use the comments facility on the website so other people can react to your comments. This episode of SE Radio, as well as all other episodes, are licensed under the Creative Commons 2.5 license. Please see the website for details. Thanks to Charlie Crow and the Podsafe Music Network for the music used in this show. The song is called Vegas Hard Rock Shuffle.